The mansion stood on the edge of the city like a silent monument of success, tall, commanding, and breathtakingly beautiful. Its marble pillars gleamed white under the morning sun, and golden gates guarded its entrance like loyal sentinels. Inside, the chandeliers sparkled, the grand staircase curved like a ribbon of art, and priceless paintings adorned every wall. To an outsider, it was paradise, a world built by power and perfection. But within those grand walls, something darker lingered, an emptiness that no luxury could fill. The mansion belonged to Edward Cole, a billionaire known for his empire in real estate and technology. To the world, he was a symbol of achievement, a man who turned everything he touched into gold. His wife, Isabella Cole, was admired as one of the city's most graceful women, elegant, intelligent, and always perfectly poised. Together, they looked like the picture of success, the perfect couple, the perfect life, the perfect family. But perfection is often the most fragile illusion. Their 8-year-old daughter, Lily, knew this better than anyone. She lived in a palace that was too quiet, too cold. Her toys were expensive, her clothes always brand new, yet her heart felt old and lonely. Her parents were always too busy. Edward buried himself in work. Long hours, endless meetings, business dinners that stretched past midnight. Isabella, tired of being alone, filled her time with charity events and social gatherings, her smiles practiced and hollow. The mansion, though full of people, drivers, cooks, gardeners, and maids, felt like a ghost house to Lily. She often wandered the long hallways, her little footsteps echoing against marble floors, wondering why her parents didn't laugh anymore. Sometimes she would sneak into her father's study just to smell his cologne, or sit on her mother's dressing chair and touch her makeup brushes, pretending they were talking to her. Downstairs in the kitchen, Grace, the black maid who had worked for the Coles for 3 years, watched the family quietly. She was in her late 30s, warm-hearted and calm, with kind eyes that had seen both joy and pain. Grace came from a humble background. She had worked hard all her life, raising her own children before coming to the city for a better job. To her, the Coles mansion was not a dream, but a reminder that wealth could build walls as easily as it built homes. Grace noticed the tension long before anyone spoke about it. The unspoken silences at breakfast, the forced smiles at dinner, the sound of doors closing harder than they should. She saw Lily's lonely eyes and recognized that look, the quiet ache of a child who only wanted warmth. One morning, while dusting the staircase, Grace overheard muffled voices rising from the living room. She paused, listening. It was Edward and Isabella again, the same argument, a different day. "You're never home, Edward. Do you even remember what your daughter looks like?" Isabella's voice trembled, a mix of anger and heartbreak. Edward's reply was sharp. "Everything I do for this family. But you wouldn't understand what real responsibility looks like." Grace winced. She wished she could close her ears. Meanwhile, Lily was upstairs clutching her teddy bear. She could hear every word. Tears welled in her eyes as she tried to block out the shouting by humming her favorite lullaby, the one her mother used to sing when things were still good. When the shouting stopped, the mansion fell into an eerie silence. It wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. Grace walked into the hallway just in time to see Lily standing by the staircase, eyes swollen and face pale. Her tiny shoulders shook as she wiped her tears with the back of her hand. The sight broke Grace's heart. In that moment, she wanted to run to her, to hug her tight and tell her everything would be okay. But she hesitated. She was just a maid. She wasn't supposed to get involved in the family's personal matters. That was the rule. But Grace wasn't just an employee. She was human, and she had seen enough pain in her life to know when a heart was breaking right in front of her. As she continued polishing the stair rail, she whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, help this house find peace again. Help this little one smile." Later that day, as the sun set beyond the tall glass windows, the mansion glowed golden on the outside, but inside it was dim and heavy. Edward locked himself in his study. Isabella sat alone in her room, and Lily fell asleep hugging her teddy bear, still sniffling from her tears. Grace walked quietly through the corridors, turning off the lights one by one, her footsteps echoing softly. She looked around and thought, a home isn't made of marble and money. It's made of love, and they've lost that. She didn't know it then, but soon her small act of kindness, one simple moment of compassion, would change everything. It would heal wounds money couldn't touch and remind a broken family what truly mattered. And though she was just a maid in the eyes of the world, she was about to become something far greater, the heart that would bring life back to a dying home. The evening sky hung heavy with grey clouds, and thunder rumbled far in the distance, as if nature itself sensed the storm that was about to erupt inside the Cole mansion. The air in the grand living room was thick, charged with unspoken resentment. The mansion, usually filled with the soft hum of servants and the ticking of the grand clock, was eerily still. Edward Cole stood by the window, his jaw clenched, his eyes sharp with frustration. His expensive suit was slightly wrinkled, unusual for a man who prided himself on control. In his hand he gripped a glass of whiskey, its amber liquid trembling as his anger grew. Isabella, dressed in a flowing silk robe, stood across from him, her face pale but her eyes burning with fire. "How long will this go on, Edward?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "You come home past midnight, ignore your family, and then expect everything to be fine. Lily barely sees you." Edward's tone was ice cold. "I'm doing what I have to do, Isabella. This company doesn't run itself. You enjoy the luxury, don't you? The house, the cars, the lifestyle. It all comes from my hard work." Her lips quivered as she spoke, her voice rising with every word. "Hard work? Is that what you call it? Working so hard that you forget to be a father? Or a husband?" Edward slammed the glass down on the table, shattering it into pieces. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. "Don't you dare question my love for this family," he shouted. Upstairs, a small voice gasped. Lily had been drawing in her room when she heard her parents' voices. At first, she tried to ignore it. She had grown used to the occasional argument, but this time it was different. The sound was louder, sharper. She dropped her crayon and tiptoed to the top of the staircase, peeking through the railing. Her heart pounded as she saw her father yelling, her mother crying. The people she loved most in the world looked like strangers. Tears filled her eyes as she hugged her teddy bear tightly. "Please stop," she whispered softly, but no one heard. Downstairs, Isabella was no longer calm. "You think money can fix everything, Edward. You've bought this mansion. You've built your empire, but what about us? What about Lily? She cries every night because she misses her father." Edward turned away, his voice softer now, but still heavy with pride. "I'm doing this for her future, Isabella, for you. You just don't understand. Maybe I don't want this kind of future," she snapped. "Maybe what she needs isn't a future of diamonds, but a father who tucks her in at night." The silence that followed was deafening. At that very moment, Grace the maid was dusting the nearby shelf in the hallway. She froze when she heard the argument, her hands trembling around the feather duster. She had witnessed tension before, but tonight's words cut deeper. It wasn't just anger. It was pain, years of unspoken distance finally breaking free. Grace peeked slightly through the doorway and saw Lily standing halfway down the stairs, tears rolling down her cheeks. Her little hands gripped the railing, and her shoulders shook as she sobbed quietly. Grace's heart clenched. She had seen children cry before, but something about Lily's sorrow felt different, too deep for her age. It was the kind of sadness that came from watching love fall apart. She hesitated. Maids weren't supposed to interfere with family matters. That was the rule. She could lose her job if Edward thought she was eavesdropping or meddling, but in that moment Grace's conscience spoke louder than fear. She looked at the fragile child before her, the innocent soul trapped between two adults blinded by pride, and knew she couldn't stand by any longer. Grace set her duster aside, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked quietly toward the staircase. Each step she took seemed to echo louder in the silence. "Miss Lily?" she whispered gently, kneeling at the bottom step. Lily looked up, her cheeks wet and her eyes red. Grace smiled softly, trying to make her voice warm and calm. "It's okay, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups just forget how to talk nicely when their hearts are full of pain." Lily sniffled. "They hate each other," she said between sobs. "They always fight. I just want them to stop." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. "No, darling," she said tenderly, brushing a tear from Lily's face. "They don't hate each other. They're just lost right now, like travelers in a storm. And sometimes," It takes a little sunshine to remind them which way home is. The child blinked at her, trying to understand. Sunshine? Grace chuckled softly. Yes, maybe your smile is that sunshine. Lily gave a faint, uncertain smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough for Grace to see a spark of hope. Behind them, Edward and Isabella's argument faded into silence. The sound of their daughter's soft sobs had reached them both, piercing through their anger like a knife. Edward turned slowly, his expression shifting from rage to guilt as he saw Grace comforting Lily. Isabella covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Neither of them spoke. For the first time in a long time, they felt ashamed that a stranger had shown their daughter more compassion than they had in weeks. The thunder outside finally broke, rain pouring heavily against the mansion windows, washing away the dust, cleansing the air. But inside, another kind of cleansing had begun. A small act of kindness from a humble maid had planted the first seed of healing in a home that had forgotten how to love. And though Grace didn't know it yet, this moment, simple, gentle, and brave, would be the beginning of a miracle. The storm outside raged on, wind howling through the trees, rain tapping fiercely against the tall glass windows of the Cole mansion. Inside, everything felt heavy and cold, the kind of silence that doesn't bring peace, only sadness. The echoes of Edward and Isabella's argument still lingered like smoke in the air. The mansion, once filled with laughter and life, now seemed like a prison built out of pride and regret. Grace watched little Lily sitting on the staircase, her small head bowed, tears still streaking her soft cheeks. The child clutched her teddy bear to her chest, as if it were the only thing left that loved her unconditionally. Grace's heart ached. She had seen broken families before, but this one was different. Here love still existed. It was simply buried beneath walls of misunderstanding. Slowly, Grace approached the little girl. Her footsteps were gentle, her voice even softer. "Hey, sunshine," she whispered, crouching down so she was at eye level with Lily. "Why are those pretty eyes raining today?" Lily sniffled and looked up, her voice barely audible. "Mommy and Daddy were fighting again." Grace nodded slowly, pretending to think very hard. I see. That's serious." She tapped her chin dramatically. "Maybe they forgot the secret rule." "The secret rule?" Lily asked, curiosity breaking through her sadness. Grace leaned closer and whispered, "The rule that says, whenever life gets too sad, we have to make funny faces to chase the clouds away." Lily blinked, her small nose twitching as she tried to understand. Before she could ask another question, Grace suddenly crossed her eyes, puffed her cheeks like a balloon, and made a silly fish face. Lily stared for 2 seconds, and then giggled. A small, shy giggle, but a real one. Grace gasped theatrically. "Oh no, you laughed. Now the rule is working." Lily laughed again, covering her mouth. "You look so funny, Grace." "Funny?" Grace pretended to be offended. "I'm the most serious lady in the world. Look!" She stood up straight, puffing her chest and putting one hand on her hip, but she still had her crossed eyes and puffed cheeks. Lily burst into laughter again, louder this time. Grace picked up a napkin from the nearby table and twisted it into a shape. Within seconds, she turned it into a little paper bird. She held it out and made a high-pitched voice. "Hello, Miss Lily. I'm Mr. Chirpy. I heard someone's smile went missing today." Lily giggled again, wiping her tears. "You're silly, Grace." Grace made the bird hop up her arm and perch on her shoulder. "Silly? Me? I'll have you know I once made the Queen herself laugh so hard she snorted her tea. That made Lily laugh so hard she nearly dropped her teddy bear." For a few precious moments, the sound of her laughter filled the grand staircase, a sound the mansion hadn't heard in far too long. Unbeknownst to them, 2 figures stood at the end of the hall, Edward and Isabella. They had followed the sound of their daughter's voice, their hearts still raw from guilt. When they reached the stairs, they stopped, watching silently. There was Grace, their maid, humble, simple, dressed in her worn uniform, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside their daughter, making her laugh like nothing else could. Edward felt something twist inside him, shame perhaps, or maybe realization. How had it come to this? That a woman who had so little could give his daughter what he, with all his wealth, could not. Joy. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she clutched her husband's arm. "Look at her," she whispered. "She's smiling again." Grace noticed them standing there but pretended not to. She wanted this moment to belong to Lily. She continued her playful act, making the paper bird fly around the little girl's head. "Quick, Miss Lily. If we make 3 laughs in a row, the storm outside will stop." Lily counted between giggles. 1, 2, 3. They both looked toward the window dramatically, and Grace gasped. "See, it's already slowing down." Indeed, the rain had softened into a drizzle, the thunder fading in the distance. Lily looked amazed. "You're magic, Grace." Grace smiled softly. "No, sweetheart. The real magic is in here." She gently touched Lily's chest, right where her heart was. "That's where all your smiles live. Sometimes they just need a little help finding their way out again." Lily looked thoughtful, then smiled, a pure, glowing smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you, Grace." Grace brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Any time, my little sunshine." Edward took a quiet step forward, his throat tight. Isabella squeezed his hand, both of them speechless. They didn't want to interrupt, but they couldn't stop the tears forming in their eyes. In that moment, the walls of the mansion, the same walls that had echoed with anger, seemed to breathe again. Something had shifted. The laughter of one child, sparked by the kindness of one humble woman, had melted away months of bitterness. When Grace finally noticed them, she stood quickly, embarrassed. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, ma'am. I was just—" Edward interrupted gently, his voice soft. "Don't apologize, Grace." He looked at Lily, still giggling, then back at her. "You've done something I couldn't, thank you." Grace smiled politely and bowed her head. "Sometimes, sir, all a child needs is someone to remind her that laughter still belongs to her, no matter how loud the world gets." As she walked away quietly, the storm outside cleared completely, and the evening sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light into the once dark home, and for the first time in a long, long while, the Cole mansion felt alive again, because a maid's gentle magic had reminded them what happiness truly sounded like. For a long moment, the Cole mansion stood in a rare and fragile stillness. The laughter of a child, in soft, pure and genuine, danced through the grand hall like sunlight breaking through the cracks of a darkened room. Edward and Isabella stood frozen at the base of the staircase, watching a scene so simple yet so powerful it left them speechless. Their daughter, little Lily, sat on the polished marble steps, giggling uncontrollably as Grace, their black maid, made the paper bird flap and talk in funny voices. The air that once felt suffocating now carried warmth, as if the walls themselves were breathing again after holding in years of silence. Edward's grip on Isabella's hand tightened. He hadn't held her hand in months, perhaps even a year. The last time he had done so, they were attending a charity gala, smiling for cameras, pretending to be perfect. But this moment, unplanned, unpolished, raw, felt more real than any of those nights filled with champagne and applause. Isabella's eyes shimmered with tears. Her gaze was fixed on Lily, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I can't remember the last time I saw her laugh like that." Edward swallowed hard, guilt pressing down on him like a weight. "Neither can I," he admitted quietly. "We've been so caught up in everything that doesn't matter." For years, Edward had believed success would bring happiness, that the more he provided, the stronger his family would be. He had built skyscrapers, bought private jets, and signed deals worth billions. Yet in the pursuit of everything, he had lost the very thing that truly mattered, peace inside his home. And now, watching Grace, a woman who owned so little, give his daughter what all his wealth couldn't, made him feel painfully small. Grace, still unaware they were watching, continued her gentle magic. "All right, Miss Lily," she said with a grin. "Our paper bird needs a name. What should we call him?" Lily thought for a moment, her small fingers tapping her chin. Mr. Happy," Grace laughed. "Mr. Happy it is. And you know what Mr. Happy says? He says that even when grown-ups forget how to smile, little girls like you can remind them." Lily giggled again, clutching her teddy bear. "I'll remind them, Grace. I'll remind Mommy and Daddy." Those words pierced Edward's heart like a whisper from heaven. His daughter, so innocent, so pure, was trying to save them even when he couldn't save himself. Isabella's tears fell freely now, and she didn't bother to hide them. Grace finally turned and froze when she saw them standing there. Her smile faded, and she quickly straightened, bowing her head respectfully. "Oh, sir, ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to—" Isabella interrupted softly, her voice trembling. "Don't apologize, Grace, please." She stepped forward, her tone filled with gratitude rather than authority. "You've given our daughter something we couldn't. Joy." Grace looked humbled, her hands clasped nervously in front of her apron. "Ma'am, I just wanted to cheer her up. She looked so sad." Edward exhaled, his voice low and sincere. "You did more than that." He looked at Lily, who was still smiling, then back at Grace. "You reminded us what love looks like." For a few moments, no one spoke. The sound of rain had stopped, and the faint chirping of birds outside filled the silence. It was as though the storm, both outside and inside, had finally passed. Isabella knelt beside Lily, brushing her daughter's hair gently. "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry," she whispered. "Mommy and Daddy shouldn't fight like that." Lily looked up, her voice soft but wise beyond her years. "It's okay, Mommy. Grace says people fight when their hearts are full of pain, but I think your hearts are just tired." Isabella smiled tearfully, pulling her daughter into her arms. "You're right, baby. They are tired, but you make them strong again." Edward knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both his wife and daughter. For the first time in a long while, the three of them held each other, not out of duty but out of love. Grace stepped back quietly, not wanting to intrude on their healing, but inside she smiled. She had seen broken things mend before, but witnessing love rebuild itself right before her eyes was something divine. Edward looked up at her and said, "Grace, I can't thank you enough." Grace shook her head. "You don't have to, sir. Sometimes love just needs a little reminder." The sun began to peek through the clouds, and golden light streamed through the tall windows, bathing the family in warmth. It was as if the mansion itself sighed with relief, no longer just a house of luxury, but a home awakening again. Edward stood and walked to the window, watching the sunlight glisten on the wet garden outside. "I've built skyscrapers that touch the sky," he murmured, "but I couldn't build happiness in my own home. Grace, you've taught me more in one evening than I've learned in years." Grace smiled humbly. "Sir, the heart doesn't need blueprints. It just needs kindness, and in that soft, sacred moment surrounded by love, laughter, and the fading scent of rain, Edward realized that the greatest wealth he could ever possess wasn't measured in dollars or diamonds. It was the warmth of his wife's hand in his, the sound of his daughter's laughter, and the quiet wisdom of a maid who had shown him what it meant to be truly rich. That night, the mansion was cloaked in a stillness it hadn't known in years. The rain had stopped, and moonlight now streamed through the tall windows, bathing the marble floors in silver. Every sound, the ticking of the antique clock, the soft hum of the air conditioner, seemed louder than usual. Yet it wasn't the same emptiness as before. The silence felt calm, like the quiet that follows a long storm. Edward sat alone in his study, surrounded by walls of leather-bound books and shelves filled with trophies of his success. The soft light from his desk lamp flickered against the whiskey glass in his hand. He wasn't drinking, only holding it, staring into the amber liquid as if searching for answers he'd ignored for years. On his desk lay an old photograph of him, Isabella and Lily at the beach, the summer before his company had taken off. In the picture, his arms were around his wife and daughter, all three smiling brightly under the sun. Edward barely recognized that man anymore. He looked alive, free, human. Now he just felt hollow. He ran his hand through his hair and exhaled deeply. "When did we lose it?" he whispered to himself. "When did I start chasing everything but the things that matter?" The door creaked softly behind him. "Edward?" came Isabella's gentle voice. He turned and saw her standing there, wrapped in a light shawl, her face still showing traces of tears, but calmer than before. She looked vulnerable, not the polished, untouchable woman she often presented to the world, but the real Isabella. "I didn't mean to wake you," Edward said quietly. "You didn't," she replied, stepping into the room. "I couldn't sleep." For a moment they just stood there, the space between them heavy with all the words they had never said. Finally, Isabella broke the silence. "I saw you looking at that picture," she said softly. "We were happy then." Edward nodded slowly. "Yeah, before the deals, the deadlines, the late nights, before I thought success meant never being home." Isabella walked closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "I blamed you for everything," she admitted, "for being absent, for not listening, for forgetting us. But maybe I forgot something too. I forgot what it means to love without conditions, to be patient, to be kind. I got lost in resentment. Her voice trembled on the last word, and Edward stood up. Isabella, he said, his tone filled with regret. I wasn't there when you needed me. I kept saying I was doing it for our future. But what's a future without the people you're fighting for? They looked at each other, years of pain softening between them. Then unexpectedly, Isabella's eyes filled with tears again. Did you see Lily tonight? Edward nodded, his voice breaking. Yes, I've never seen her so happy. Grace did that, with nothing but kindness. They both fell silent again, the maid's name hanging in the air like a quiet truth neither could deny. Grace, the woman who had cleaned their floors, folded their clothes and lived in their shadows, had done what they, with all their luxury, could not, bring light back into their home. At that moment, a soft knock came at the door. Sir, ma'am? Grace's voice was gentle, hesitant. Come in, Grace, Edward said. Grace stepped in, her hands clasped in front of her apron. I was just making sure everything's all right. It's been a long evening. Edward smiled faintly. You're right. It has been. He hesitated, then spoke from his heart. Grace, I wanted to thank you for what you did for Lily tonight. You have no idea how much that meant. Grace shook her head humbly. Oh, you don't need to thank me, sir. I only did what anyone should do for a child who's hurting. Isabella stepped forward. No, Grace, you did more than that. You reminded us what love looks like. Grace's warm eyes met theirs. Sometimes, ma'am, she said softly, people forget that love isn't about never arguing. It's about remembering why you started loving each other in the first place. And children, they feel that love even when it's hidden. They just need to see it again. Edward looked at her thoughtfully. You speak with wisdom, Grace. She smiled faintly. When you've lived through enough storms, sir, you learn how to find light in the smallest places. Her words lingered in the air, more powerful than any sermon. Isabella wiped her eyes. Grace, thank you, truly. Grace bowed slightly. You don't have to thank me, ma'am. Just promise one thing. Edward frowned gently. What's that? She looked at them both, her eyes kind but firm. Promise me you'll talk to each other. Not shout, not accuse, but talk. Because children don't need perfect parents. They just need to see love survive. The couple exchanged a glance and nodded. Grace smiled. Good night, sir. Good night, ma'am. Then she quietly closed the door behind her, leaving the room filled with silence once more. But this time, it was peaceful. Edward turned to Isabella. She's right, he said softly. We've both been fighting for control instead of fighting for each other. Isabella smiled weakly through her tears. Then maybe it's time we start over. He reached for her hand, the same hand he had held years ago when they first fell in love. And this time it didn't feel strange. It felt right. They stood there, surrounded by trophies, wealth, and power, yet realizing that the greatest treasure they had was something money could never buy. And outside, the moonlight glowed over the mansion's garden, touching everything with quiet grace, as if the night itself was whispering, forgiveness is the first step toward home. The sun rose softly over the Cole estate, spilling golden light across the marble halls that once echoed, only with silence. For the first time in a long while, the mansion didn't feel cold. The morning air carried the gentle aroma of coffee, freshly baked bread, and something else. Peace. Grace was already in the kitchen, her hands moving skillfully as she prepared breakfast. She hummed an old gospel tune under her breath, the kind that wrapped a soul in warmth even before the first bite of food. She cracked eggs, flipped pancakes, and added strawberries, Lily's favorite, with a small smile tugging at her lips. She didn't expect anything unusual that morning. To her it was just another day of work, another morning in the grand house that often felt too big for its own happiness. But something was different. The walls, once tense with unspoken words, seemed to breathe easier. As Grace set the table, she noticed movement at the kitchen door. It was Edward, but not the Edward she usually saw. He wasn't dressed in his sharp designer suit or talking on the phone with that distant tone of command. He was in a simple shirt and jeans, his hair slightly messy, his face softer. He smiled awkwardly when Grace looked up. "Good morning," he said almost uncertainly. Grace turned, surprised. "Good morning, sir. You're up early today." He chuckled lightly. "Couldn't sleep much. Thought I'd help, though I'm afraid I don't know my way around the kitchen." Grace laughed. a real hearty laugh that made even the morning air seem brighter. "Well, sir, there's a first time for everything." Edward nodded, rolled up his sleeves and awkwardly began to slice fruit under Grace's patient instructions. She watched as the billionaire, a man who had built empires with his mind and money, struggled to cut a pineapple without making a mess. When a chunk of it slipped from his hand and landed on the counter, both of them burst into laughter. "Guess I'll leave the cooking to you," he said, smiling in a way that felt genuine, even boyish. "Smart choice." "Sir," Grace teased gently. Just then, small footsteps echoed through the hallway. Lily appeared, wearing her favorite pink pajamas, her hair still tousled from sleep. She blinked in surprise when she saw her father in the kitchen. "Daddy?" she asked, rubbing her eyes. Edward turned and smiled warmly. "Morning, sweetheart." She ran up to him and hugged his leg. "You're home." He bent down and lifted her into his arms. "Yes, I am. And I'm staying for breakfast this time." Grace watched quietly, her heart swelling. It was a sight she had prayed to see, the simple, unpolished beauty of a father and daughter reconnecting. A few moments later, Isabella entered the kitchen, drawn by the sound of laughter. She stopped in the doorway, astonished to see her husband cooking or at least trying to. The scent of pancakes filled the air, and for a second, she simply stood there, soaking in the warmth she hadn't felt in years. Edward noticed her and smiled sheepishly. "Don't laugh," he said, holding up a spatula like a white flag. "I'm trying to make pancakes. Grace said I need supervision." Isabella couldn't help but laugh softly. "I'm impressed, actually. You never even boiled water before." He shrugged. "Guess I'm learning." The tension that once lived between them melted away as they exchanged smiles. Grace, sensing the delicate moment, quietly stepped back to give them space. They sat down for breakfast together, something so ordinary, yet so extraordinary for them. The table was filled with laughter, stories, and little moments of joy. Lily told a silly joke that made her parents laugh until tears filled their eyes. Grace poured juice, watching the family with quiet pride. Halfway through the meal, Edward set his fork down and looked around. "You know," he began, "for the first time in a long time, this house feels like a home again." Isabella reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "It's because we stopped shouting long enough to listen." Lily tilted her head innocently. "And because Miss Grace makes the best pancakes in the world." Grace smiled, her eyes shining. "Thank you, sweet girl." Edward looked at her, serious now. "Grace, you've done more than make pancakes. You brought something back into our lives that we'd lost. Kindness. We'll never forget that." Grace shook her head humbly. "All I did was remind you of what was already there, sir. Sometimes love just needs a little nudge to wake up." Her words sank deep into Edward's heart. He glanced at Isabella and Lily, his entire world sitting right there, and realized how close he had come to losing it all. After breakfast, as Grace cleared the table, Isabella stopped her. "Grace," she said softly, "I know we've never said this properly, but thank you. You're part of this family now, always." Grace blinked, surprised, then smiled. "That means a lot, ma'am." Edward nodded in agreement. "We owe you more than we can ever repay." Grace's smile widened, humble yet proud. "Just promise me you'll keep laughing together. That's payment enough." Outside, the sunlight spilled through the windows, illuminating their faces. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and distance, now felt alive with love and laughter. It wasn't just a new morning. It was a new beginning. The days that followed that peaceful morning felt like a soft miracle inside the Cole mansion. The rhythm of life began to slow down, not in the sense of less activity, but in the sense of more meaning. The echoes of anger and distance that once filled those grand hallways had been replaced by something new: laughter, conversation, and an unfamiliar but welcome simplicity. Edward started spending more time at home. The once urgent calls from his company were now met with, "I'll call you back later. I'm with my family." For years he had been a man running an empire, but now he was learning to walk again, not on boardroom floors, but through the simple joys of being a husband and father. Every morning he joined Lily for breakfast, walking her to the garden before school. They would chase butterflies, play catch, and sit under the old oak tree that had once been ignored, the leaves whispering like a lullaby. Edward found himself Laughing again, really laughing, and for the first time in years. Isabella, too, began to change. She no longer filled her days with shopping trips or meaningless social gatherings. Instead, she spent her time with Lily, baking together in the kitchen or reading stories at night. More than anything, she began to see Grace not as an employee but as a person, as someone with her own story, her own heart, her own quiet strength. One afternoon, Isabella approached Grace in the kitchen. "Grace," she said softly, her tone gentle in a way it hadn't been before, "would you mind sitting with me for tea?" Grace looked surprised but smiled. "Of course, Mom." They sat together at the small round table near the window. The sunlight bathed them both in a soft glow as Isabella poured tea. There was no tension, no hierarchy, just two women sharing a quiet moment. "I realized," Isabella began, "I've never asked about you." "About your life before you came here." Grace smiled faintly, stirring her tea. "There's not much to tell, ma'am. I've had my share of struggles, but every hardship teaches you something. Mostly, it teaches you gratitude and how to see people for who they are, not what they have." Isabella listened, humbled. "You have a beautiful way of seeing life." Grace's eyes softened. "When you've lost enough, you learn to value the things that last: love, kindness, honesty, the things money can't buy." Isabella's gaze dropped to her cup. "I forgot that for a long time." Grace reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "You remembered in time, Mom. That's what matters." Tears welled in Isabella's eyes. "Thank you, Grace, for helping us remember." Meanwhile, Edward was making changes of his own. He called a meeting with his company board and announced something that shocked everyone. "I'm stepping back," he said. "From now on, I'll be working fewer hours. I've realized that success means nothing if it costs you your family." His colleagues stared in stunned silence. The man who once lived and breathed business was now talking about family dinners and taking weekends off. But Edward didn't care. He felt lighter than he had in years. Later that evening, he returned home earlier than usual. Lily ran to him, giggling, as Isabella and Grace stood nearby. Edward lifted his daughter high into the air, her laughter filling the room. "Guess what?" he said, his eyes bright. "No more late nights at the office. From now on, I'm home every evening." Lily squealed and hugged him tight. "Really, Daddy?" "Really," he said, kissing her forehead. Grace watched the scene with quiet joy. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The transformation spoke louder than words. In the days that followed, the Coes began opening their hearts to more than just each other. Edward donated a large sum to local schools and community centers, but not in the flashy way he used to. This time he did it quietly, often volunteering his time to speak with underprivileged children about hope, not wealth. Isabella began organizing charity events, not for status or photographs, but to truly make a difference. She often brought Grace along, introducing her proudly to everyone. "This woman," she would say, "taught me more about love than I ever learned from all my luxury." Grace would blush, laughing softly. "Mom, I only reminded you of what was already there." One evening, the family gathered in the living room. The fireplace crackled gently as Lily played with her dolls on the rug. Edward and Isabella sat together on the couch, watching her. Grace entered quietly to say goodnight. "Grace," Edward said, standing, "before you go, and there's something we'd like to tell you." She paused, curious. Isabella smiled warmly. "We want you to stay with us, not as our maid, but as part of our family. If you're willing, we'd like to sponsor your education or whatever dream you've put aside for others." Grace was speechless. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to find the right words. "Sir, ma'am, I don't know what to say." Edward smiled. "Just say yes." Grace laughed through her tears. "Yes, thank you. From the bottom of my heart." That night, as she walked to her small room, she looked back down the hallway and saw the family together, laughing, united, whole. Her chest filled with quiet pride. She had not just cleaned a house, she had healed a home, and somewhere deep in her heart, she whispered a small prayer of gratitude, not for the wealth around her, but for the love that now lived within those walls. Months passed, and the Cole mansion had become almost unrecognizable, not in structure but in spirit. The same halls that once echoed with silence and sorrow now resonated with laughter, footsteps, and music. The air that once felt heavy now carried warmth, the kind that only love and peace can create. Edward Cole, once known in business circles as the cold, untouchable billionaire, was no longer the same man. He still ran his company, but he ran it differently now. Instead of chasing profits, he pursued purpose. He implemented programs for his employees' families, offered scholarships to workers' children, and made time to personally visit his projects in poorer neighborhoods. Everywhere he went, people noticed something different about him. He smiled more. He listened more. He thanked people, sincerely. When asked what had changed him, his answer was always simple. I was reminded of what really matters. Isabella, too, had blossomed into someone new. The poised, distant woman who once lived behind walls of luxury had become softer, more compassionate. She used her resources to fund orphanages and women's shelters, always visiting in person, spending time with those in need. She had found a joy that money could never have bought, the joy of giving. But perhaps the most beautiful change was in their daughter, Lily. Once withdrawn and quiet, she had become a bright, joyful spirit, a reflection of the peace that now lived in her home. She adored Grace and often followed her around the house, calling her Auntie Grace. Their laughter could be heard echoing through the hallways like a song of light. One golden afternoon, the family gathered in the garden. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the scent of blooming roses filled the air. Grace sat under the old oak tree, reading a story to Lily while Edward and Isabella watched from the porch. As Grace turned the page, Lily giggled and said, "Auntie Grace, can you tell me again how you made Mommy and Daddy stop fighting?" Grace laughed warmly. "Oh, sweetheart, I didn't make them stop. They just remembered how much they loved each other." Lily tilted her head. "But how did they remember?" Grace smiled. "Because love is never really gone, my dear. Sometimes it just hides until someone shines a little light on it." Lily grinned and threw her arms around Grace. "You're the light, Auntie Grace." Edward and Isabella watched with teary eyes. Isabella whispered, "She's right, you know." Edward nodded. Grace didn't just bring light to Lily, she brought it to all of us. Later that evening, after dinner, Edward called Grace into his study. The room, once filled with the tension of long nights and arguments, now radiated calmness and gratitude. "Grace," Edward began, "we've been talking, and we want to make something official." Grace looked at him curiously. "Sir?" He smiled. "We've set up a scholarship fund in your name, the Grace Foundation. It will help women and young people from underprivileged backgrounds get an education and build a better future." Grace gasped softly. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Isabella stepped forward, her eyes shining. "Say you'll let us honor you. Because what you gave us, hope, love, and humility, deserves to be shared with the world." Grace's lips trembled as tears welled in her eyes. "You're too kind. I only did what my heart told me to." Edward shook his head gently. "Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of lives. You changed ours, Grace." For a moment, all three stood there in silence, the kind that speaks louder than any words. That night, as the stars glittered above the mansion, Grace sat by her window in quiet reflection. She thought of her own life, the struggles, the loneliness, the long years of serving others, and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had not only found a job here, she had found a family and a purpose. Down the hall, Edward tucked Lily into bed. "Daddy," she murmured sleepily, "are you happy now?" Edward smiled and brushed her hair back. "Yes, sweetheart. Happier than I've ever been." "Because of Auntie Grace?" she asked. He nodded. "Yes, because she reminded me how to love." Lily yawned and smiled. "Then I'll never forget her." He kissed her forehead. "Neither will I." The next morning, the first rays of sunlight spilled into the house, touching every corner with golden warmth. Grace walked through the halls, greeting everyone with her usual smile. Yet now every greeting she received back was full of genuine affection, not the polite nods of employers, but the warmth of family. In that grand mansion, wealth no longer ruled, love did. And as the days turned into months, people across the city began to hear about the Grace Foundation and the story behind it. The story of a maid who changed a billionaire's heart. and a family who learned that the truest riches are found not in fortune, but in forgiveness. Grace's laughter, Lily's giggles, and Edward and Isabella's voices blended together like music, a song of redemption, love, and new beginnings. The mansion that once stood as a monument to pride had become a beacon of hope, proof that sometimes one act of kindness can heal what money never could. And from that day forward, anyone who entered those doors could feel it, the invisible presence of something sacred and everlasting, a home reborn by grace.